Beneath the makeup of a clown was a monster. John Wayne Gacy entertained children, shook hands with politicians, and buried his darkest secrets under his own home. How does a man become a killer in plain sight? To answer that, we need to start at the beginning. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. Outwardly, his childhood looked normal. He was the second of 3 children in a working-class Polish-American family. But behind closed doors, shadows loomed large. Gacy's father, John Stanley Gacy, was an auto repair machinist and a heavy drinker. Known for his violent temper, he beat his son regularly, often calling him weak and useless. Young John craved his father's approval, but was met with fists and insults instead. His mother, Marion, tried to protect him, but her shielding only fueled his father's rage. These contradictions, nurturing on one side, cruelty on the other, created the emotional fault lines that defined Gacy's early life. From an early age, Gacy battled serious health problems. He suffered blackouts and fainting spells, later discovered to be caused by a congenital heart condition. He was not athletic and, unlike other boys, couldn't play sports. This made him an outcast and his father's target for more ridicule. Instead of football or baseball, young Gacy turned to domestic life. He learned to cook, garden, and sew, skills unusual for boys of that era. While his mother praised him, his father accused him of being soft. By his teenage years, Gacy was overweight, insecure, and desperate to fit in. Yet deep inside, anger and humiliation began to take root. Despite his struggles, Gacy learned early how to charm people. At school, he became known as a talker, someone who could win teachers over with compliments or quick answers. But beneath the surface, troubling signs emerged. At age 11, he was caught touching a girl inappropriately. At 15, he was accused of fondling a younger boy. His father dismissed these incidents, labeling John as odd, but never intervening. This mix of charm, secrecy, and deviance would later define Gacy's adult life. By his late teens, Gacy realized he was attracted to men, a secret he kept buried. In 1950s America, homosexuality was heavily stigmatized, often criminalized. For Gacy, this inner conflict became a dangerous pressure cooker. Outwardly, he worked to appear normal, dating women and throwing himself into community activities. But inside, he carried shame and confusion. Each rejection by his father only intensified his need to hide and to control. After dropping out of high school, Gacy drifted. He briefly attended business school, then found work in sales. His charm and ability to connect with strangers made him successful in customer-facing roles. But trouble followed him. At age 18, during a violent argument, his father knocked him unconscious. After this, Gacy left home for good. In the early 1960s, he moved to Las Vegas, where he worked briefly at a mortuary. There he lived on-site and became fascinated, perhaps disturbingly so, with the bodies. He later admitted that one night, he climbed into a coffin with a young deceased male, caressing the body before jolting back to reality. This chilling episode foreshadowed the dark urges that would later drive his crimes. Shaken, Gacy left Las Vegas and returned to Chicago, then moved to Springfield, Illinois, to work as a shoe salesman. Here, he began crafting the image he wanted the world to see, a friendly, hard-working, normal man. He joined the Junior Chamber of Commerce, volunteered, and threw himself into community events. In 1964, at just 22, he married his first wife, Marlyn Myers. Her wealthy family gave him opportunities, and for a time, it seemed like Gacy had finally found stability. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form. His marriage was strained, his drinking escalated, and whispers about his interest in teenage boys began circulating. In 1968, Gacy's carefully built facade crumbled. He was accused of luring teenage boys with promises of alcohol, pornography, and money in exchange for sexual acts. He was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His wife divorced him, and his father died while he was behind bars, never reconciling with his son. Yet even in prison, Gacy thrived in the spotlight. He became head cook, charmed staff, and built a reputation as a model prisoner. After serving just 18 months, he was released on parole in 1970. The world thought John Wayne Gacy had paid his debt. In reality, prison only sharpened his ability to manipulate. Upon release, Gacy moved back to Chicago. He quickly remarried and started a construction business that employed young men, many of whom would later become his victims. By day, he wore a mask of success, hardworking, social, even dressing as Pogo the Clown at community events. By night, his urges returned stronger than ever. The man who once slept beside the dead was now hunting the living. By the early 1970s, John Wayne Gacy had it all: a business, a marriage, and the trust of his community. But beneath his suburban home, a darkness was waiting to be unleashed. And soon, young men across Chicago would begin to vanish. By the early 1970s, John Wayne Gacy was the picture of suburban success. A business owner, a devoted husband, even a clown at children's parties. But behind the smiling mask, something monstrous was stirring. And soon, young men across Chicago would begin to vanish without a trace. After his release from prison in 1970, Gacy wasted no time rebuilding his life. He remarried, moved into a quiet house in Norwood Park, a suburb of Chicago, and launched his own construction business, PDM Contractors. It was the perfect cover. His company employed young men, many in their late teens, who saw Gacy as both boss and mentor. He paid well, offered them drinks, and invited them into his home. Meanwhile, he grew active in local politics, posing for photos with mayors and shaking hands at fundraisers. To the outside world, John Wayne Gacy was a model citizen. But behind closed doors, the facade cracked. In 1972, Gacy committed his first known murder. He lured 16-year-old Timothy McCoy into his home after meeting him at a bus terminal. The next morning, Gacy stabbed McCoy to death, later claiming it was self-defense. Instead of guilt, Gacy felt something chilling: pleasure. He described the moment as a mind-numbing orgasm. For Gacy, murder became an awakening. Soon after, the disappearances began. Young men who crossed paths with Gacy, workers, hitchhikers, runaways, simply vanished. After each killing, Gacy faced a practical problem: what to do with the bodies. At first, he buried them in his crawl space beneath the house. One body became two became 10. The small space turned into a private cemetery. Gacy later joked that he thought of it as his mortuary. When the crawl space grew too crowded, he began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. By the mid-1970s, Gacy had killed more than a dozen young men. To his neighbors, Gacy was still the friendly clown. He performed at charity events as Pogo the Clown, painting his face with exaggerated red lips and blue diamonds. But his makeup was unsettling. Unlike typical clowns, Pogo's face paint had sharp edges, giving him a sinister look. Children saw only a funny man making balloon animals. Adults saw a community leader. No one suspected that the man behind the makeup was hiding dozens of corpses beneath his floorboards. Between 1972 and 1978, young men began vanishing at an alarming rate. Most were last seen in or around Chicago. Many were hitchhikers or runaways, easy prey for Gacy's manipulations. He had perfected a cruel trick: the handcuff game. He would show his victims how to slip into a pair of cuffs as part of a magic trick. But once they were locked in, the game turned deadly. Gacy would then assault, torture, and ultimately strangle his victims, often with a rope tightened using a piece of wood. By 1975, neighbors began complaining about strange odors around Gacy's house. Some described it as rotten or sewage-like. Gacy blamed it on moisture, dead rodents, or plumbing issues. His excuses were convincing enough, and complaints were dismissed. All the while, the crawl space continued to fill. Victim after victim, buried in shallow graves just beneath his home. The contradictions in Gacy's life grew starker. By day, he threw parties for neighbors, dressed as a clown, and volunteered. By night, he hunted vulnerable young men. One evening, he could be entertaining children. The next, burying another victim. He lived in two worlds, public adoration and private horror. And no one could see how close these worlds were colliding. By 1978, more than 30 young men had vanished. Families searched. Police wrote reports. But no one suspected the friendly clown. No one imagined that beneath the quiet suburban home on Somerdale Avenue, a graveyard was growing. And soon the world would find out. By late 1978, John Wayne Gacy's House of Horrors was nearing exposure. For years, his victims had been dismissed as runaways, forgotten by a system that didn't look too closely. But one missing boy would change everything and unravel the mask of the killer clown. On December 11th, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest was working at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. That evening, he mentioned to his mother that he might have a job opportunity with a contractor, one that paid better than the pharmacy. The man offering the job? John Wayne Gacy. Robert promised he'd be home soon, but he never returned. When Robert's worried family contacted police, it wasn't just another runaway report. His parents insisted he was a responsible, grounded teenager. Something was wrong. Detectives quickly learned that Piest had left with John Wayne Gacy, a respected local businessman. At first, Gacy seemed cooperative, but his behavior raised suspicions. He claimed he never met Robert Piest. Yet police found inconsistencies in his story. They began tailing Gacy around the clock. What they saw was bizarre. Sometimes he was overly friendly, buying officers coffee. Other times, he grew paranoid, driving erratically as though trying to lose them. Police secured a search warrant for Gacy's home. They didn't find Robert Piest, but what they did find was disturbing. Teenage clothing, a class ring with initials that didn't match Gacy's, handcuffs, a receipt linked to the pharmacy where Piest had worked. The evidence wasn't enough to arrest him for murder, but it was enough to keep digging. As the surveillance continued, Gacy began to unravel. He drank heavily, used drugs, and even confessed to friends and associates that his life was over. At one point, he gave a bizarre speech to his lawyers, admitting to killing maybe 30 people. His mental state was deteriorating. Detectives realized time was running out. If Gacy snapped, others could be in danger. On December 21st, 1978, police obtained a second search warrant. This time, they were prepared for something bigger. As they entered Gacy's home, the stench was undeniable. Officers noticed it immediately, a foul, rotting odor seeping up from the crawl space. One officer would later recall, "I knew then. We were standing on a graveyard." What they uncovered was beyond comprehension. One body, then another, then another. Shallow graves stacked beneath the suburban home. The crawl space was a burial chamber, filled with the remains of dozens of young men. Excavations would continue for days as authorities carefully removed body after body. By the end, 29 victims were found beneath Gacy's home. 4 more were pulled from the nearby river. The final count, 33 young men. With the grim discoveries mounting, John Wayne Gacy was arrested. The killer clown, the neighbor, the contractor, the political volunteer, was unmasked as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. When asked how many he killed, Gacy chillingly replied, 33. But who's counting? The discovery shocked the world. Parents demanded answers. The media descended on Chicago. And the trial of John Wayne Gacy would become one of the most notorious in history. But what would it take to convict the man who hid his crimes behind a painted smile? By December 1978, John Wayne Gacy had been unmasked. But uncovering his victims was only the beginning. Ahead lay a trial unlike anything Illinois had ever seen. A courtroom battle that would expose the depths of his depravity and test the limits of justice. As investigators pieced together the remains of 33 victims, prosecutors prepared their case. Each body was a story of unimaginable horror. Forensic teams identified victims, while grieving families packed the courtroom, desperate for justice. Gacy's defense? He admitted to the killings, but claimed insanity. His lawyers painted him as a man split in two, the friendly clown versus a deranged killer who couldn't control his urges. But prosecutors countered. This was no madness. This was methodical, planned, and cold-blooded murder. The trial began in February 1980. For 5 weeks, the world watched. Witnesses described Gacy's double life. Contractor by day, predator by night. Survivors of Gacy's assaults testified about his handcuff tricks, his cruelty, and his terrifying laughter. But the most haunting testimony came from experts who detailed how victims had been strangled with ropes, their bodies hidden beneath the very floors of his home. The jury sat in silence, absorbing every gruesome detail. Throughout the trial, Gacy remained unsettlingly calm, sometimes smirking, sometimes sketching clowns on notepads. At one point, he joked with guards. To many, it was clear this was not a man overcome by madness. This was a man who reveled in his notoriety. On March 13, 1980, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on 33 counts of murder. The sentence? Death, 12 times over. As the ruling was read, families wept. Reporters rushed to the phones. Gacy sat stone-faced, as though the words meant nothing. For the victims' loved ones, justice had finally spoken. Gacy would spend 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center. During that time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them clowns. He sold his artwork, granting interviews, and bizarrely attempted to profit from his infamy. He continued to deny guilt, claiming he was the 34th victim. To many, it was one last insult to the families of those he murdered. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some carrying signs, others selling T-shirts that read, "No tears for the clown." When asked for his final words, Gacy spat out a defiant phrase, "Kiss my ass." At 12:58 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Even in death, Gacy's legacy haunts true crime history. He shattered the illusion of safety in suburban America. He showed the world that evil could wear a friendly face, volunteering at parades, dressing as a clown, shaking hands with politicians. To this day, his name is synonymous with the word monster. The story of John Wayne Gacy reminds us that the greatest horrors don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they smile, shake your hand, or even make balloon animals for your children. Behind the paint was not laughter, but murder. And behind the mask of the clown was one of history's most notorious killers. If you found this documentary informative, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. What do you think? Was John Wayne Gacy the most terrifying serial killer of the 20th century, or does another name come to mind? Let us know in the comments.